Hello, my name is Himanshu Thakkar. Uh, I work for an organization called South Asia Network on Dams, Rivers, and People. We work on issues related to water, dams, hydropower projects, and related issues. By education, I'm an engineer from IIT Bombay, but I have been engaged in this sector for more than 30 years. And our organization, of which I'm a founder member, is more than 2 decades old. It was established in 1998. So today I'm going to talk about the hydropower sector in India. Hydropower essentially means it's about generation of power from the flow of water. India is one of the biggest developer of hydropower projects in the world, among the top fifth or sixth one. And if you look at in terms of the number of large dams in India, India is the third largest builder of large dams in the world. India currently has installed hydropower capacity of about 45,700 megawatts. So these are from what is called large hydropower projects. So in India, small hydropower projects is defined as projects with installed capacity less than 25 megawatts. So those are additional about 5,000 megawatt of installed capacities from small hydro. So total combined large hydro and small hydro, the capacity would come to more than 50,000 megawatts. India has been developing hydropower projects starting towards the end of the 19th century, when one of the first small hydropower projects was built, one close to Darjeeling, another close to Mussoorie. And those were India's first hydropower projects. So we have come a long way from that point where we started it. Of course, the use of water to generate mechanical energy is much older than these hydropower projects. So we have had what is called generally called water mills. Those kind of water mills which are used flow of water to run floor mills or some such mechanical machines. That has been there for many centuries. When we say hydropower, we essentially mean generation of electricity from hydropower. So that's about 125 years old in India. There are four kinds of hydropower projects in India. One is what is called a storage hydropower project. Another is what is called run up the river hydropower project. The third is what is called pump storage hydropower project. And the fourth, the small hydropower projects, which will also include, for example, mini or minor or micro or pico hydropower projects. So, depending on the scale of the installed capacity, this description is there. But coming back to the first three, India started with building more of storage hydropower projects. So, Bhakra is possibly one of the earliest dam built for purpose included hydropower was one of them. But before Bhakra, the construction of Hirakud started. And before Hirakud, there were other big hydropower projects like the Krishnaraj Sagar and Mettur on Kaveri. So these were some of the earliest big hydropower projects, storage-based hydropower projects. In storage-based hydropower projects, what happens is you have a huge reservoir, a big dam which stops the flow of water in the river and stores the water behind the dam. And there is a big storage, in terms of several 100 million cubic meters of storage is there. And then because the dam is very high, and when you allow that water to flow through that height, that water has a lot of power. And if you have a turbine at the bottom of where this water hits, if you have a turbine, then that water will actually run that turbine. And if you run that turbine basically in magnetic field, you can generate the power. And that's how you generate electricity from hydropower. This is broadly how you can describe the generation of hydropower from storage dam. So these are some of the major ones India has built. But there are a lot of adverse impacts of hydropower projects. So typically, before coming to those impacts, and also the other kinds of hydropower projects I described, let me say hydropower projects, there is a huge lobby which supports hydropower projects in India. And they like to describe hydropower in a very romantic way. So they say that hydropower is a clean source of electricity. It's a green source of electricity. It's a renewable source of electricity. It's a sustainable source of electricity. It's a cheap source of electricity, and so on. Now, each of those are claims essentially. And if you were to look at it objectively, all of those claims have really no foundation, no scientific basis actually. But we'll come to that. The second type of hydropower project is what we can call run of the river hydropower projects. Because when you build a large reservoir, it leads to submergence of large area, which can be thousands of hectares of land, hundreds of square kilometers of area can be submerged. And those kind of submergence not only involves forest land, but can also involve people, their habitations, displacement of very large sections of people. And India has been one of the worst examples in terms of rehabilitation of people. Of the people who are displaced by the dams need to be rehabilitated, because even the World Bank says that if a dam or hydropower project is supposed to be a developmental project, then you need to ensure that the people who get adversely affected by the project needs to be rehabilitated in such a way that they are happier after the dam, not worse off, and their standard of living goes up. Now, India has not achieved that kind of rehabilitation even in a single dam. Some of you are from Andhra Pradesh, and if you look at Andhra Pradesh's oldest dams like Srisailam or Nagarjuna Sagar, those people who have been displaced by those projects are not been never been rehabilitated. If you take the first dam that was started construction in India after independence, which was Hirakud, the people displaced by Hirakud are still not fully rehabilitated according to state government. If you look at the most celebrated dam, which whom Nehru called the temple of modern India, the Bhakra, people displaced by Bhakra in Himachal Pradesh are still not rehabilitated. So, leave aside the question of the most controversial dams like the Narmada or the northeast dams like Lower Subansiri. No project in India has been able to rehabilitate the people displaced by the dam in a just way, in a manner that the people are better off after rehabilitation. And because of that, there has been a lot of opposition to big dams in India. When that opposition became very strong and very big over the years, then there was a pressure on the developers. And then they came out with a phrase, we can also build hydropower projects through what they called run of the river hydropower project. And they claimed that that was environment friendly way of generating power, electricity from hydropower. Now, this is also a claim that run of the river hydropower project is a more environment friendly hydropower project, but we'll come to it later on. So essentially, a run of the river hydropower project also involves a dam, but that dam, the storage capacity is not equal to the storage capacity of big storage projects like Sardar Sarovar or Tehri or Srisailam or Nagarjuna Sagar. The storage capacity is lower. So it is not that it doesn't have dam. It is not that it doesn't have storage capacity. It has storage capacity of a few million cubic meters, but it is not as big as the storage projects. How does it generate power then if it doesn't have? So what it does is that in a run-of-the-river hydropower project, the storage, is used to divert water through first a desilting chamber. Then from desilting chamber, after removal the silt from the water is passed through a tunnel. Mostly it's an underground tunnel. That tunnel will be long. A tunnel will be a few kilometers. It can be up to 60 kilometers long. And that length of the tunnel, when that ends, at that point, there will be a turbine. And before turbine, there will typically be surge well. So the water then from this headrace tunnel, from the dam, the water enters the headrace tunnel, and then it goes into, at the end of the tunnel, it goes into a surge shaft. And from the surge shaft, then a penstock starts from the other end of the surge shaft. At the end of the penstock, which is a few hundred meters or a few meters long, there will be a turbine. So what happens is, because there is an elevation difference between the point where the water enters the headrest tunnel and the point where the turbine is. That difference of elevation is used to generate power. The water flowing through the headrest tunnel and penstock and through the turbine, there'll be huge quantity of water. Almost the whole river gets diverted this way. Even a big river like, say, a Chenab or Bias or Ravi or Satluj, this kind of big rivers can be fully diverted through this kind of tunnel and into the turbines. And the elevation difference can be several meters or sometimes even much higher, several hundred meters also. And using that difference of elevation, power generation, and then after the generation, the river will enter back through a Taylor's tunnel into the downstream river. The distance between the point where the dam is constructed in the run of the river hydropower project and the point where the water enters back into the river can be 60 kilometers, 70 kilometers. But it can be lower, it can be 2, 3 kilometers, it can be 10, 20, 30, 40 kilometers also, depending on the capacity, elevation difference, length of the tunnel will change in the length of. Now, this length of the river, where, between the point where the dam is constructed and the point where the tailless tunnel water enters back into the river, that stretch of the river can be totally dry. They don't need to divert any water into the river, and all the water in the river, particularly in a non-monsoon months, will be diverted into the tunnel. In monsoon months, the capacity of the diversion tunnel may not be that high. And so in monsoon months, they may still have to spill some water from the dam. But in non-monsoon months, 100% of the water gets diverted. Now, that means the river in that stretch of a few kilometers to 70 kilometers can be totally dry until and unless some water enters from other small tributaries downstream, which means that there is no hydrologic longitudinal connectivity between the upstream river and the downstream river, which also leads to destruction of the river, the biodiversity river, and all the services that the river provides, including the life of the fish and all the biodiversity in the river. And river, incidentally, is one of the most biodiverse rich entity on earth. So it's total destruction of that, it's destruction of livelihood, it's destruction of access to the river, and so on. This tunnel blasted from the dam to the turbine, that tunnel can be huge. Say it can be 9 or 10 meters in diameter. If you have a circular tunnel of 10 meters diameter, you can imagine how big it is. It's like 3 trains running on one on top of the other, and 3 trains again running side by side. That kind of huge tunnel is blasted. And typically, run of the river hydropower projects is constructed in mountains. It can't be constructed in plains because in the plain area, the elevation difference will not be high even if you go for 70 kilometers. So hydropower generator is not viable in plains area. A run-of-the-river hydropower project. Run-of-the-river hydropower project has to be in the mountain area. Now, in mountain area, particularly most of run-of-the-river hydropower projects come up in the Himalayas and Western Ghats. In those areas, when you blast this kind of tunnel, you can imagine the kind of, first of all, the impact on the blasting in the tunneling of that, constructing that kind of tunnel will be. And then once you have constructed that, blasted that tunnel and constructed it, then it has geological impact. It has impact on the water sources en route. It has impact on the houses and construction along the way. And then even later on, the whole area becomes very disaster prone. So what you can see from all this is that the kind of impacts that a run-of-the-river hydropower projects is very different than the storage hydropower project. And there are so many additional impacts in terms of the drying of the river, destroying of the biodiversity of the river, and in terms of the blasting and tunneling and so on. Now, one more impact, which is you can't immediately envisage, is that when you have this kind of tunnel, you also generate millions of cubic meters of muck, rocks and debris and so on. Now, again, you need to have safe disposal of that muck. Typically, every hydropower project claims that we are disposing of that safely. Now, if you want to have a safe disposal of that kind of muck, you need to have a lot of land area, and then you need to acquire that kind of land. And it can't be very far from the construction site, because the longer distance it becomes more expensive. It's again a mountain area, so you don't get that kind of land easily. And then when you have to transport that kind of millions of cubic meters of muck from the site of generation to the point where you need to have this kind of muck disposal site, and then you need to ensure that the muck where it's disposed of, because it's also mountain area, you need to have stabilize that area and ensure that it remains stabilized and it doesn't muck doesn't flow downstream. Now, all of this again involves so much cost, and typically hydropower projects don't find it attractive and nobody's watching. So they just mostly dump all the millions of cubic meters of the debris that they create directly into the river, and which again creates impacts in the downstream area. In addition, when you divert water from the dam, you have a desilting chamber. Why do you need desilting chamber? You need it because the water that flows from this kind of small storage dam into the tunnel will have a lot of silt and debris. Now, silt and debris, if that flow into the turbine, then the turbines will get damaged. So you need a silt-free, debris-free water from the reservoir. Now, that's not possible immediately. So that's why desilting chambers are constructed. Now, what happens at the desilting chambers is that from the top of it, you take off the water so that it's silt-free water mostly. But at the bottom, there is silt accumulation. Now, that you need to continuously dispose of it. Now, that continuously gets disposed into the river bed immediately downstream from the dam, but that flows with very small amount of water. So what happens is that silt doesn't flow much farther into the river. It gets accumulated in the riverbed. And then when the monsoon comes and there is a lot of flow in the river, then at that point, all of that silt again flows downstream. So this is another impact. So, there are so many different kinds of impact. The water that then enters after generating power from turbine to tail race into the river back is a silt-free water. Now, a silt-free water, you must always remember, is a very hungry water. Geological term, geomorphological term, it is called hungry water. So that water, when it flows into the river, it actually has a huge erosion capacity. Now that's additional impact. And then when that enters the river, that river doesn't have biodiversity because that water is biodiversity less. It's dead water. This is a description of a typical run-of-the-river hydropower project. It has less impact as far as the reservoir behind the dam has less area submergence compared to a storage project. And so there is a less submergence, means less displacement, less deforestation in that reservoir area. But there is so much more additional impact of that dam, of that run-of-the-river hydropower project. So, if someone says that run-of-the-river hydropower project is more environment friendly, then it's a highly questionable claim. It is no scientific basis. What I described is one run-of-the-river hydropower project. In mountain areas on a river, we have maps which I could have shown. If you go to our website, sandrp.in, and if you go to the map section, you will see that there are maps of river basins where bumper to bumper such projects are constructed. We call it bumper to bumper. It's like a traffic. Now, that's the kind of run-of-the-river hydropower project constructed in Himalayas. If you look, for example, Bhagirathi or Alaknanda or Satluj or Ravi or Bias or Chenab, or if you go to Tista, all of the places, some of the places already constructed, some of the projects under construction, and some of the projects planned. If you take all of them, then we will have a bumper to bumper situation in most of these river basins. In Tista, it's already situation like that in most of the stretches. In many other rivers also, in Satluj, for example, it's the same situation. Satluj, Ravi, and Bias. In Chenab, the plans are to have that kind of situation in future. And this is just the main river. There are tributaries also the same situation. In Western Ghats, if you see, there are several rivers which are in similar situation. So we have this kind of bumper to bumper situation, dams and projects in many rivers. And in fact, there are very few undammed rivers in India. As they say, even if one dam is there, it can destroy the biodiversity of the river. In Urdu, there is a couplet which says, "Yahan har dal pe ullu baitha hai, anjam mein gulistan kya hoga." So that's the situation of the rivers in India. Most rivers are destroyed by dams and hydropower projects, besides the other effects the rivers have in terms of the pollution, encroachment, dumping, mining, and so on. Coming back to the claims of hydropower projects being clean, green, cheap, or sustainable source of energy, if one looks at objectively at the total impacts of the hydropower projects, none of them is true. What I have described in terms of around the river hydropower projects are the direct impact of the projects. There are other impacts. For example, one of the impacts which most people don't understand and don't even know is that what we call disaster potential. When you build a run-of-the-river hydropower projects in Himalayas or any mountain areas like Western Ghats or Himalayas, these areas are already disaster prone. Disaster prone in terms of high rainfall, disaster prone, so floods, in terms of erosion, in terms of flash floods, which is different than floods, in terms of landslides. So there is a lot of landslide prone areas, and because of the high rainfall and the slopes, the landslide potential goes up. These are all also mostly seismic areas. So there is a lot of seismic activity, earthquake activity happening, which also accentuates the landslide potential and disaster potential of these areas. Now, in these areas, you also construct this kind of dams and hydropower projects. As I said, they all involve dams. Now, building of dams also means you need to have foundation, very deep foundation, and then you need to again do blasting for the foundation. You need to mine materials, construction of the dam. You need to submerge area, a forest area, and then you have this tunneling and blasting. All of these activity, each of them adds to the disaster potential in the mountain areas. Each of the disaster I described, whether it is landslide or floods and flash floods, and these hydropower projects act as force multipliers actually. So this increase of the disaster potential of the area is something that's not even assessed or understood or acknowledged by the developers. They don't even look at it when they do environment impact assessment. And incidentally, all projects which are larger than 25 to 50 megawatts in India needs environment impact assessment. Environment impact assessment essentially means that before you construct the project, you envisage what kind of impacts the project will have, and you assess those impacts in a scientific way. You assess both environmental and social dimensions of those impacts, and then you create an environment impact assessment. Now, I have been challenging both the Ministry of Environment and the hydropower developers in India to show us a single environment impact assessment of a dam or hydropower project in India, which can be called an confidence inspiring, credible assessment of environment impacts of any dams in India. It doesn't exist in India. What it means is that we are not even honestly assessing the impacts of the dam, because if you don't assess, you can't even start mitigating those measures. So we are not even doing that. And then on top of it, we claim it's environment friendly, it is a green, clean, cheap, renewable source of energy. It is none of them. One of the claims, of course, is that hydropower does not lead to generation of greenhouse gases. The climate change is the biggest crisis that is facing the mankind today. Typical understanding of global warming, climate change is that the most of the generation of the carbon dioxide, methane, and such global warming gases comes from burning of either coal or fossil fuels like petrol or diesel or aviation fuel or kerosene or gas, natural gas, and so on, because all of them lead to generation of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, and so on. Now, the claim of the hydropower projects is that the electricity generation from hydropower projects does not involve a burning of fossil fuel, and hence it doesn't lead to global warming. Now, again, this claim is totally wrong. Now, you will ask why. So there are two broad reasons. One is that the reservoirs that you create behind the dams, whether it is storage dam or run-of-the-river hydropower project, all of those reservoirs are sources of methane. And remember, methane is a much stronger potential global warming gases than carbon dioxide, 24 times more stronger potential. So every molecule of methane generates 24 times more impact on the atmosphere than a molecule of carbon dioxide. Now, how does methane get generated in a dam? or a reservoir behind the dam. The reservoir has come up by submerging land and submerging forest. Now, when you submerge, any wood or any organic matter, when you submerge it at the bottom of the reservoir, there is a situation like typically in a biogas plant. Now, I'm sure you all know, most of you know what is a biogas plant. A biogas plant is a plant in which we allow the digestion of gobar or some organic matter in anaerobic condition. Anaerobic means without contact with the air. In an anaerobic condition, when you digest the organic matter like gobar or some such organic matter, it leads to generation of methane. And that's the methane. When you burn biogas, you are burning the methane. The same situation prevails at the bottom of the reservoir. There is no air there. Oxygen is very small quantity because at the bottom of the reservoir, it's several meters below the surface of the water. And there is a lot of organic matter. When that gets digested or deteriorated, decomposed, in absence of air or oxygen, it leads to generation of methane. And that's huge quantity actually. Secondly, even the soil has organic content. In addition, the river, when it enters the reservoir, it also continues to bring every year from the upstream catchment area a lot of organic matter and debris, and sometimes even the wood. And that again gets continuously digested at the bottom of the reservoir. And that leads to generation of methane. Now that methane then travels up. When it travels up from the bottom of the reservoir towards the surface of the reservoir, some of it gets decomposed in carbon dioxide, but that's also methane, global warming impacting gas. In addition, in a hydropower project, you take the water not from the surface of the water, but from below the surface of the water, because you need to take water which has a head. You want to have sufficient head above it. And because of that, when you take water from below the surface of several meters below the surface of the reservoir, at that point, the methane concentration is very high. And when that water is released after the generation of electricity from turbine, downstream of turbine, the methane is released from the water. When you open a Coca-Cola bottle, the gas fizzes out, the compressed gas. Same way, the compressed dissolved methane and carbon dioxide in the water again gets released when you have water comes out of the turbine. So that's also a source of methane. Another source of methane is that, the hydropower projects leads to submergence of forest or destruction of forest. The forest itself is a carbon sink. And the project, when it leads to destruction of forest, it leads to destruction of a carbon sink. So that's another source of global warming from the dams. And the third source is that you used such a huge quantity of steel and cement in the production of those items, and similarly use of other fuels that you use in the construction. In that production, again, there is a generation of global warming. So there is a lot of generation. And remember, this methane generation from the bottom of the reservoir is a lifelong process. It continues. The rate may go down after some years, but it still continues. And there are estimates, the scientists have estimated in countries like Brazil how much global warming impact of a reservoir-based hydropower project is compared to a similar capacity of a thermal power project. And their estimate is that it can be comparable. It can be the same or higher than a thermal power project in some cases, not all cases. In some cases, it can be less. But it is not that it's zero. It's still very highly impacting the global warming. See, hydropower projects has all these impacts. If we were to honestly assess all the impacts and ensure we mitigate some of them, whatever we can mitigate, we can minimize whatever we can minimize, and we can manage what we can manage, and then we can compensate what we can't. If we were to have an honest effort in that direction, and if we take all of that into the cost of the hydropower, if you were to, arrive at the conclusion that the cost of the power from hydropower project is comparable or less than the power from, say, solar or wind in the today's context, then you can still claim that it is cheap source of power. But since it is not, it is not. In fact, today, let me say, the cost of power from any hydropower project which is now under construction or planned in future will be not less than 7 rupees per unit, 6 to 7 rupees per unit at the minimum, absolute minimum. It can be much higher. So if it is 6 to 7 rupees per unit, it's much higher than solar and wind. One more claimed benefit of hydropower project is that they provide peaking power. What is the peaking power? Essentially, peaking power is our electricity demand is not constant. Electricity demand goes up in morning hours, goes up in evening hours, but in rest of the hours it is lower. Similarly, the electricity demand goes up in certain seasons, but is lower in other seasons. Because you can't store electricity and you can't start thermal power projects just when the demand goes up, you start, and demand goes down, you can shut off. That you can't do with the coal-fired thermal power project. But you can do that in a hydropower project. Hydropower project, one advantage is that you can start it in minutes and you can shut down in minutes. When the demand goes up, you have the facility of suddenly increasing the production from hydropower and then reducing when demand goes down. It can provide additional power during peaking hours. Now, this claim, one is to look at very objectively. First of all, one needs to understand that peaking power cannot be accepted just because there is a demand. The countries around the world do a lot of effort to manage the peak demand, to reduce the peak demand. One of the things they do is, for example, that the cost of the power during peaking hours is much higher than non-peaking hours. Because of that kind of cost difference in the power cost, lot of companies, commercial operations or industrial operations, or even some of the domestic operations are staggered so that they are done during off-peak hours. This leads to management of peak. So the first thing we need to do is manage the peak. We are doing nothing in terms of that in India. Secondly, we need to see that how much of the hydropower that is generated today from this 50,000 megawatt of installed capacity, how much of it is generated during peaking hours? Because if the peaking power is the claimed benefit of hydropower project for which we are building more hydropower projects, that's what the hydropower lobby claims. Then we need to firstly understand that how much of the power that we are generating currently, peak hour power that we generate, comes from hydropower. And if you ask that question, there is no answer because there is no agency in India which is even monitoring peaking hour power generation from hydropower, leave aside reporting and ensuring optimization of power generation during peaking hours. Firstly, we are not managing peak. Secondly, we are not even monitoring or optimizing power generation from existing hydropower. And thirdly, we need to also ensure a more scientific management is there. And because we are not doing any of that, we can't really justify more of hydropower projects in the name of peaking power. We need to also understand a run-of-the-river hydropower project, for example, during the monsoon months when so much water coming into the dam, you can operate it as a peaking station or as a base load station. Now, because you want to maximize the power generation, so most of the run-of-the-river hydropower project operate as base load station during monsoon at least, or even at least a month after the monsoon, when you have a lot of water. And so in the Himalayan areas, even a month before the monsoon, because a lot of snow melt, glacial melt is happening during the summer. So there is a half the year the run-of-the-river hydropower projects don't even operate as peaking station. So we need to understand that this claim that hydropower projects is justified because they provide peaking power, there is no scientific basis for that either. And lastly, when we operate a hydropower project as a peaking station, then there are additional impacts. What happens is that peaking hours are typically, say, 4 hours in the morning and 4 hours in the evening when the power demand is high. When you operate a hydropower project as a peaking power station, you will be generating power during those 4 morning hours and 4 evening hours if you have the sufficient water. And the rest of the hours, you won't be generating any power, which means in the river downstream, there will be suddenly surge of lot of water in those 4 hours, morning hours or evening hours, and in the rest of the hours, there won't be any water. The river downstream will become a danger zone. And there have been several projects in which, because of this kind of operation, people have died in the downstream river. Tourists in Himachal Pradesh, when they visit some of the rivers, they suddenly see that the river doesn't have water. They see small amount of water flowing. They see big rocks and they go to the river, enter the river. And then suddenly, without warning, there is water coming from the upstream. Suddenly, huge quantity of water. So there are a lot of additional impacts, both in terms of the deaths and injuries, but also the river downstream. There is a lot of impact. One of the things that is done to generate peaking power without constructing big reservoirs is what is called a pump storage hydropower project. In pump storage hydropower, this is the third kind of hydropower project which I mentioned in the beginning. In this kind of project, there are two dams actually. There is a dam in the upstream and there is a dam in the downstream. From the dam in the upstream, during the peak hours, you release water. And so the upstream dam becomes empty during those peaking hours. And all the water that flows from downstream from the turbines into the river, just downstream from that point, there will be another dam. And that will store upstream water that flown down during the peaking power generation. And that stored water is then pumped back through that same turbine. There are turbines available which operate as reversible pump. And so the turbines are used as reversible pumps to pump that water stored in the downstream dam back to the upstream dam on non-peaking hours. And that cycle then continues. Next peaking cycle, again, they will generate. Now, what it means is that this kind of pump storage hydropower project, net, they don't generate power. Actually, they are consumer of power. So, for example, because if you were to generate power for releasing, say, 100 liters of water to the downstream dam, if you were to pump back that same 100 liters upstream, you will need, if you are, say, for example, generate 100 units of power, you will need 120 or 130 units or 140 units, depending on the efficiency, to pump back that same quantity of water back to the upstream. So a pump storage hydropower project typically is a consumer of power. And that's justified only again when you have a power cost in the grid, there is a higher power cost during the peaking hours, then only you can justify. But in India today, a large number of such projects are under construction now. There is no again justification for it because you don't need to construct new dams for that. If you have an existing dam, you can also just have a small dam in the downstream, and for that, US, for example, has stopped building hydropower projects and dams. For wherever they need peaking power, they are going for either pump storage or even existing dams which there is no hydropower component. They try and building hydropower component. In fact, US is decommissioning more and more dams. They don't find that dams are any more profitable. In last about 20 odd years, they have decommissioned more than 1,000 big dams. Some other countries in the Europe are also decommissioning dams. The world is going in the opposite direction compared to we, India, where we are still trying to build more dams. Hydropower projects which are no longer viable, as I described, if the cost of the power from new or under construction hydropower projects is more than 7 rupees, then there is no justification for hydropower projects because you get cheaper power from solar and wind, which is less than 3 rupees per unit. So why should we be building hydropower projects? And as far as peaking power is concerned, I already said why it is not justified. Building of more dams for power is anyway not justified. And most importantly, the phrase run of the river is totally wrong. A run of the river phrase seems to tell you that from the run of the river, that means just the river keeps running and you generate power, which is not the case actually. You have a dam which stores water, which stops the flow of water, and then you use that. Today, there is no justification for any more hydropower project, but there are turbines now available where you don't need even a small dam. You can just have a floating platform on a river, and just from the flow of water in the river, at the bottom of the floating platform, there can be small turbines which can generate small quantity of power, and you can have more such to generate power. It will also have some impact on the fish and the biodiversity. So we need to understand those impacts. Some of the impacts we have not even assessed. Most of our river today, there is no fish actually, no natural fish that used to be there. And the fisher people whose livelihood dependent on the fish, catching fish from the river, their livelihood is destroyed. And there has never been, let me note it and underline this, there has never been any compensation for the destruction of livelihood of the fisher people in any river, behind any dam, any hydropower project in India. They don't even assess those impacts. If you look at how much area is irrigated in India, and if you look at the production of agricultural crops from area irrigated, and if you look at the source of the irrigation, most of the irrigation in India doesn't come from dams. It doesn't come from rivers. More than 2/3 of the irrigated lands in India get irrigation from groundwater. So most of the irrigation and each hectare, each unit of groundwater irrigated land produces more greater yield than a surface water dam irrigated land. Why? Because when to provide water and how much to provide water is broadly in the control of the farmer. Now they are providing more and more of power during fixed hours. It is broadly in his control. And because of that, the yield of those lands which are irrigated by groundwater much higher. So, and if you look at the situation of the rainfall pattern in India, there is no longer any justification for building dams even for irrigation. Our best and most efficient source of irrigation is groundwater. And the best way to sustain groundwater irrigation is to harvest rain where it falls. If we do that, then we will be able to create a most sustainable source of irrigation and we won't need dams at all. In India, it's very shocking. Any project with a capacity less than 25 megawatt does not even need environment impact assessment. It is just assumed that it is environmentally benign, which is totally wrong. Even a 1 megawatt project will have impact. If you go very small in terms of, say, micro hydro, say less than 100 kilowatts of installed capacity, it's very small stream and very small capacity, providing power only for the village use locally. In such a situation, the impact will still be there, but the impact are clearly seen. So they can see what is the impact. They'll possibly accept those impact. Whoever is affected could be compensated within that community. And so that kind of project can still be viable, a very micro or pico hydro kind of project. But a small hydropower project, what is described between 25 megawatt and say 1 megawatt in India, they will always have impact and they should have impact assessment and management plans and so on. Unfortunately, there is a dichotomy seen between economy and environment. That's seen because we don't value environmental resource at all, whether it is the river, whether it is biodiversity, whether it is the forest. Now the whole impact is now coming back to us in terms of climate change. We knew all these impacts were there. We didn't bother about it. Today, all of those impacts cumulatively are coming back to us and hitting us in terms of climate change. Unfortunately, most people don't wake up. Our governments still are not woken up. They still think that, oh, it's okay, we can continue to build economy and GDP growth and hanker for GDP growth like we used to do without bothering about environment. And once we are developed like US or Europe, we will think of environment. Let me say that time is not going to come. The disaster is in front of us. It's already upon us. A very large section of India is already facing the disaster of this development that we are wrong kind of development that India is going through. And those impacts are going to multiply. The climate change is going to act as force multiplier for environmental impacts in India. And even the prosperous areas are not going to be free from the impact. Today, for example, we are talking and Chennai is usually flooded. Imagine in November month. And this is not the first time. 5 years back, we faced similar situation. This is just an example of today. But, climate change impacts are going to hit us and hit us badly and hit every one of us.